Hey there, friends. Uh, I'm back at my night theme. My face is kind of washed out by my LCD here. Check out the 2 Dickinson Street shirt. I talk about that in other videos. Let's hope we don't have technical glitches. I'm a little worried that when I do night theme, I tend to bring this ball into it, but I'm a little bit worried that this electromagnetism might interfere with the Bluetooth between us here. So now that I've set the mood, I'm going to unplug this. It's USB. And let's hope the Bluetooth holds up. I'm also not sending power to the headphones as I do this. It's kind of another test. We're doing science here. So I wanted to look at this interesting article in Wired magazine real quick. There's one particular paragraph that interests me. In the last video, I talked at the end kind of about how I think we're going to have to agree that in retrospect there was a blackout regarding sharing Fuller's most basic thinking, in other words, the concentric hierarchy, which is kind of the Sesame Street that Fuller contributes conceptually, the relative volumes and so forth. I think we're going to have to say there was a blackout in terms of getting that into like 6th grade textbooks. But then why? What was that all about? Why was there a blackout? I don't think that school teachers conspired among themselves. For one thing, they don't have control over textbook content. I worked at McGraw-Hill for a while. I've seen sort of the back end of that business, and I actually pushed for let's use some more Bucky here, and I got some anyway. Long story. Let me get to this article. So it's by Jonathon Keats, who's written this book, You Belong to the Universe, and it's got some great pictures in it. Let me just scroll to the car real quick. One of the better pictures of the car that I've seen. Now that's not as pretty as the new version, right, by Norman Foster. Let's quick Google up the new version just to compare them. The new version is built since Fuller's time using the same blueprints, and in exchange for getting one of the old cars, maybe that one, sent to England so that it could be sort of studied, and then in exchange it was returned in even better condition. Norman Foster Dymaxion car. We're going to get some cool pictures here. I've done a segment like this before. Images we want. And then I'm going to go to zoom in on a particular paragraph in that Wired article. Come on, come on. What's going so slow here? Buckminster Fuller Dymaxion car hardcover. Okay, hardcover is some hundreds of dollars, but I'm just trying to go to images here. Here we go. Yeah, beautiful, right? This is kind of alluding to an older picture where Fuller stood in front of a fly's eye dome. Here we have a reenactment of that picture using a more up-to-date Dymaxion car and the fly's eye dome. Anyway, back to the review. Hey, Silicon Valley. The name of the review is... Not sure why the internet is so slow. Let me think about this. Anyway, hey, Silicon Valley, Buckminster Fuller has a lot to teach you. So I don't think school teachers were in a conspiracy. I think more there was a desire to not have a revolution of rising expectation. As World War II came to a close, the so-called working class were experiencing a lot of benefits in terms of better civilian life standards and how high could things go. And things like the Fuller house and the Fuller car were creating a sense of rising expectations. But I think with the prime contractor irrigation system now in place, basically the whole weaponry economy that World War II had established, that had inertia, as Eisenhower told us. It wasn't about to just sort of dismantle. Now, some of the aircraft companies did try to follow Fuller, and I think the Airstream trailer or mobile home comes from aircraft background, but Fuller's whole idea that the aerospace industry would now shift gears now that the World War II was over and collaborate on a new kind of housing, that didn't happen. And I think rather than, how could we explain to future generations why we chose to stick with the killing business as more profitable? I mean, I picture myself as a CEO of a big aerospace company saying, as long as the government was going to pay us to make more missiles, we weren't going to risk our necks. Look what Fuller did. He tried to do this house, and even he thought it was too risky, and he was our chief risk taker. So if you think we're going to get out of the missile business and trying to stop killing people just because it's an altruistic concept, that's not how capitalism works. Okay? So anyway, let's get to this paragraph in this where we talk. Okay, so and then we got to do something about Fuller himself. He seems to be very sane, and he's proposing a post-war giant conversion of weaponry, swords into plowshares. Let's have higher living standards. You can't argue with that. Plus, he's got a track record of patents and interesting books. Hard to argue with that. So what can we do with this guy? What is it? Can we call him a crackpot? That would be good. So here the guy doing the interview says, reading your book, I couldn't decide whether Fuller was, as you say, quote, a zany crank, unquote, or really kind of a genius. And the author writes back, I never have met the author, and I haven't read the book. I bring that up because I think of myself as an acolyte, so I'm going to take this a little bit personally here when he talks about acolytes. He was both. I mean, he was a total crackpot in the best possible way and in the worst possible way. And yet the world would be a more impoverished place, a poorer place, were it not for his mind. And his way of thinking has largely been lost because he eventually became a caricature of himself and because his acolytes have been incapable of separating his way of thinking from the artifacts that he created. Now, at first when I read this, I thought the artifacts are really cool, like the geodesic dome, the car, the Demaxian house, the map, but synergetics is like Finnegan's Wake. It's nonsense. That's what the guy who wrote Most Beautiful Molecule implied. When he wrote about C60 and he mentioned synergetics, I argued with him. I said, look, synergetics is in the humanities. Give it a break in that sense, at least. Read it like it deserves to be read, like a philosophy, not a math textbook, okay? But he didn't like that. He didn't want to hear that humanities, that synergetics was in the humanities. It's supposed to be like STEM or something. And anyway, in what sense was Fuller a crackpot in the worst possible way? It seems like there's a lot of ad hominem going here, but it really never unpacks. We don't really find out much about it, except that the acolytes, besides him becoming a caricature of himself. Now, how does one avoid doing that? In a way, you're going to, over time, become more and more like yourself. I think we're all caricatures of ourselves in some way, but take that out. It's the mind that we miss, and it's his way of thinking apparently that got lost in the shuffle. And so I think I'm exempt from this problem because what I push is pretty platonic. Like, I'm not into the special case as much as the generalized principles, you could say, and that I'm really into the polyhedra, which I think we all agree aren't going anywhere. It's like as long as we can think, we're probably going to be able to think of polyhedra. Whereas in terms of dial telephones or mimeograph machines, a lot of us can't imagine those, and so forth. So I'm glad that we agree that it's the thinking that needs to be preserved, i.e. synergetics and all the Sesame Street stuff, and not just the artifacts. So if that's the problem, I think I see a solution here. Anyway, interesting article. Let's see how they tell it next time. They keep telling the story about how Fuller's a failure. Now, I think with all these patents and awards and all that, I mean, yeah, he was useful to the U.S. government. So then for the U.S. government to not put any of this in its public school curriculum and for the U.S. government to like turn its back on Fuller, to me that's very dangerous, right? Like when I was growing up, a lot of diplomats had Bucky books on their shelves, cultural attaché types, you know. People were fluent about Bucky and they understood the positive futurism, and to suddenly cut that off and go, oh, he was a crackpot in the worst possible way, but we sure miss him and we wish we had his mind. Does that add up? You know, I have to ask. I don't think so. All right. That's my rant for today. We'll talk to you soon.